This is the Sustainable Living and Networking Group, SLANG. Our meeting tonight on November 20th, 2015 is about homemade bread baking. So when you go to make homemade bread, everybody has papers. They've got notes. You've got a picture of a kernel of wheat. You've got a recipe. We're going to be following that recipe tonight. When you start out baking bread, you want to start with fresh ingredients, most all of them at room temperature. The first and most important ingredient of all is the wheat, the flour that you use. Bread flour will give you a better bread than all-purpose flour. Don't even bother with cake flour, it's not even going to work. Flour comes from wheat, kernel of wheat. There are three main parts to the kernel of wheat. There's the endosperm, which is the central part. It takes up the majority of that kernel of wheat. In fact, it takes up about 83% of the kernel of wheat by weight is the endosperm. That's the white part. That's the stuff they use to make white flour with. It contains most of the greatest share of protein, carbs, iron, B vitamins. It's also a source of soluble fiber. Then you have the bran, which is the layers and layers and layers of skin on the outside. That's the bran. That is included in whole wheat flour. Whole wheat flour is when they take the entire kernel, all of the thing, and grind it all up together. White flour is when they sift everything out except the endosperm and just keep that in. That's white flour. So the bran on the outside is about 14% of the weight. It's included in whole wheat flour, but you can also buy wheat bran separately on its own. The bran contains a small amount of protein, a large amount of the major B vitamins, some trace minerals, and some dietary fiber, but this fiber is insoluble. The fiber in the endosperm is soluble. The fiber on the bran is insoluble, which means it goes right on through you. But it scrubs your system pretty well. The germ, it's only about 2.5%. This is the tiny little embryo, the baby, the seed, the part that sprouts when you get it wet. It's only about 2.5% of the weight, but that's the sprouting section of the seed. It's often separated out from the flour when they make white flour because it has a high fat content, and fat goes rancid faster than things that don't have fat in them. So whole wheat flour, which contains the entire seed, will go rancid faster than white flour, which does not contain any of that fat that's in the germ. So the shelf life is a lot longer with white flour. The germ contains minimal quantities of protein, a great share of B complex vitamins, and trace minerals. You can purchase just the wheat germ separately. You've heard of wheat germ before, right? You can purchase that just separately. And that you probably want to keep in your fridge or it'll go bad. It'll go bad pretty fast because it has fat in it. So you take your kernels, you grind them all up, and if you grind up the whole thing all by itself, without anything else, you've got whole wheat flour. If you sift out the bran and the germ, then you've got white flour. And that's what we'll be starting with today, is white flour. I've used bread flour in most of the recipes I use just because you'll get a better yield. You'll make better bread out of bread flour than you will out of all-purpose. Cake flour is the lowest protein and the softest, lowest strength flour. It is like 8-9% protein. Bread flour is the highest. It's more like 14, 15, 16% protein. And then all-purpose flour is right in between. It's in the 10, 11, 12 range percent protein. The more protein you have, the more gluten you have, the stronger your flour is, the more it's able to stretch and hold its shape when you bake it. The less protein it has, the denser your thing is going to be, and so you use a lot of moisture to make a nice, soft, dense cake out of it. The recipe we're going to be using calls for all-purpose flour. You can use regular all-purpose flour, or you can use bread flour. It really does. Some recipes call for one or the other exactly. Others don't seem to mind. I would follow the recipe you have if you have a book. For example, there's a lot of books out on the table. Follow the recipe that you find, because they've made that recipe specifically for all those ingredients. The next most important ingredient you have is yeast. Comes in packets like this or containers. Sometimes it's in the refrigerated section, which is good. The cooler you can keep it, the longer it lasts. I keep my yeast in the freezer. And it's been in there for about 5 years, and it's to the point now where I have to add about half again as much as the recipe calls for because it's getting a little old. But it's still good, it still works, it's still yeast. So what it is yeast are these tiny little bitty one-celled funguses. You see they look like little tiny, those are not single cells. Each one of those little bits is a glob full of thousands of little cells of yeast. And right now they're dry. And the way you want to wake them up is to get them wet. The wetter they are, the warmer they are, the faster they grow. Getting them wet will wake them up, and then they're going to want to go find some food. The first thing they're going to want to do is find food. If they can't find food, they will die. They have nothing to eat, they'll starve. If they find food and their food is starch, sugar, carbs, flour, starch, we'll put a little bit of water in here so they'll wake up, and then you'll give them a little pinch of sugar to eat so they can have something to eat right there. There you go, guys. You can store yeast in the freezer, you can store it in the fridge, you can store it on the countertop, but like I say, the colder it is, the longer it will last you. Don't get it above 120 degrees or it will die. You'll kill the little yeasties in there. So what happens is yeast eats carbohydrates and then it gives off carbon dioxide and alcohol. There are all kinds of different strains of yeast. This is a particularly good strain for bread because it gives off a lot of carbon dioxide and not a lot of alcohol. There are strains of yeast that give off a lot more alcohol, and those are in the mead and the apple cider being fermented over there. So those particular strains of yeast, you want as much alcohol as you can get out of them. Or not. You can have yeasts that can survive a lot higher levels of alcohol or lower levels or whatever. So what happens is as the yeast eats the starch in the flour, they'll eat the flour, they'll eat the sugar, they'll eat things that are in there. They produce more yeasts and they produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. The carbon dioxide gets trapped in the gluten as you, when you have the flour, if you get it wet, you give it a fairly high temperature, like room temperature or higher, and you physically manipulate it. You're going to start making those glutens, those proteins, wind up and link together. And the more you manipulate it, you got the yeast all moving around in there with it, and it's all mixed together, and the more you knead it and everything, then you let it rest and the yeast starts making more and more gas, and the gluten is so tied up together it won't let that gas escape. So you have all these little teeny tiny bubbles all over in it. And then you take that and bake it in the oven, and it gelatinizes and it hardens and solidifies. And so then when you have bread, if you ever look at bread real closely, it's just a bunch of tiny little bubbles surrounded by the dough. So you want plenty of gluten for making big tight chains to hold all that gas in there. The stronger your gluten is, the higher more your protein is, the bigger bubbles it can support. So those big rustic loaves with all the great big holes in them, they've got a really strong flour, really high protein flour in them to support these huge bubbles that they can handle. The recipe calls for 6 to 6.5 cups of flour. Oh, besides the flour and the yeast, you gotta have sugar, because that's what the yeast eat. Some recipes call for honey, some of them call for maybe molasses or something. Salt you need for flavor. Without salt, even just a tiny pinch of salt is enough to give it a good flavor. Salt, though, inhibits the yeast. It won't completely stop it, but it will really slow it down. So you don't, like I wouldn't put a pinch of salt in with my yeast. That wouldn't be a good idea. They're not going to eat it and it's going to slow them down. Depending on your recipe, it may call for eggs, butter, oil, milk. I didn't get the milk out, but I'm not going to leave it out on the countertop today. It could call for, well, depending on your recipe, you could put cinnamon in it, and you could put raisins in it, and you could put nuts in it, and you could put herbs and spices or cheese or whatever in it. So our recipe, 6 to 6.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Well, we're going to use bread flour. And the reason it doesn't say exactly how much flour to use is because it's going to change. Depending on the temperature and the humidity in your room, you're going to need to use more or less flour. So you start out with some of the flour. You notice the first part of it, in a large bowl, combine 2.5 cups of flour. So you don't use all of the flour right away. So we're going to start off with I'm just going to get out my half cup measuring cup. So what we do is we make a real loose dough first, and then we add flour to it until we get up to the 6.5 cups, or 6, or however many cups it's going to take. You'll need cups, teaspoon, tablespoon measurers. Now in this recipe, you don't have to proof the yeast first. Proofing is when you add a little bit of water, add some of the liquid and a little bit of sugar, and just make sure that it's alive and it's blooming and it's going. These days, our yeast is so good from the store. It's all in date. You don't have to worry about it not being good. Back when my mom was a kid, 40, 50 years ago, yeah, you might have to worry. Some of your yeast might be dead by the time you went to use it, and you weren't really sure. If it had gotten wet and starved to death and dried out again, you might never know. So they used to proof the yeast all the time. We're not going to proof it because I know it's good. I just got it at the store, and it doesn't expire till next year. So this one calls for, it says combine the flour, the sugar, and the yeast and the salt. So 2.5 cups flour, 3 tablespoons of sugar, little yeasties are going to love to eat that. Now if you were making a sweet dough, you might add more sugar than this. If you were making a savory dough, you might add this or maybe a little less. And undissolved yeast. This one calls for 2 packets because we got 6 cups of flour in the end. This is like a super giant huge batch. But it's close enough to Thanksgiving. We'll probably be using it for Thanksgiving. There's 2 packages of yeast and salt. 2 teaspoons of salt. Where'd my teaspoony thing go? That's a fair amount. If I were doing a sweetbread, I might do less than that. It depends on what your recipe calls for. Get some of these things out of the way. Flour, sugar, yeast, and salt. You just stir these guys all up together. So now the yeast is going to be mixed in with the flour. So once we pour the liquid in there, the yeast will automatically start activating as soon as it gets wet. You just want to mix it all the way through so there's not anybody sitting anywhere in big clumps or anything. Now it says heat the water, the milk, and the butter until they're very warm. I already did that ahead of time. This one calls for 1.5 cups of water, 1/2 cup of milk, and 2 tablespoons of butter. Remember, you don't want it over 120 or you'll kill the yeast. This one is at, he's only at 90. He's at 88. So he's plenty cool. He's not going to hurt anybody. And you add that in there. And this is going to make a really loose dough. Stir them all up. Beat 2 minutes at medium speed of electric mixer. Oh, well, I haven't got an electric mixer, so we're just going to have to stir it. Real wet part. Really get that going. The idea here is you're hydrating the flour. You want all the little flour pieces to get wet. And all the little yeast pieces can get wet. So the next part, it says add a half a cup of flour and beat 2 minutes on high speed, scraping the bowl occasionally. Well, there's your half a cup of flour. We'll see if we can get it in with the whisk. But at some point, this whisk is going to become useless. It's really starting to get useless right now. You see how it's all starting to glob up on the whisk? That's just not going to work. So, okay, that was a half a cup. So we start out with 2 1/2. That was another half, that's 3. So that's 3 out of our 6 cups. So we don't want to forget how much we're doing here. Okay? There's 3 1/2. And the idea is you add a half a cup at a time and you stir it in. And you keep stirring it in. And you'll know when it's time to turn it out on the board and knead it, because all the flour will be absorbed and it'll start pulling away from the sides of the bowl. And that's not yet. That's 3 1/2, right? There's 4. I'm telling you, it'll be... I think with today's weather, we're not going to make it to 6 1/2. Maybe yesterday we could have, but not today. We're starting to pull away from the sides of the bowl here. This is one of my favorite little tools. You just sprinkle your flour on your board. You don't have to. My mom always just did it by hand, but... Alright. That bowl's done for. Now comes the fun part. It's still only at maybe 4 1/2 cups. We are going to have to knead some more into this. It's still a little too wet, so now we got to start kneading it, and it's getting sticky. I should have tried to incorporate more flour while I had the chance. It's wet. I can still feel little lumps in here, so it's certainly not smooth enough yet. More flour into this. Just gotta have more flour on it. So, I'm doing this really quickly, but when you knead, you turn it 90 degrees, fold it over, and push it away from you. And turn it 90 degrees, and fold it over, and push it away from you. And you just keep going like that. And if it starts to stick, like if it starts to stick on your hands, and it's too wet and it needs more flour, and you just keep doing this. Now, how do you know when your bread is kneaded enough? Well, you can't feel any more lumps in it. It'll take at least 8 or 10 minutes of kneading like this to get it into good shape. It'll be probably 78 to 80 degrees. My mom always was able to tell, she said, it's soft as a baby's bottom. And there is a certain feel to it when you know that it's done kneading. And the last way you know that it's done, and this is the most important test, this is called the window pane test. You should be able to pull your bread apart, your dough apart, and it'll stretch without breaking enough that you can see through it. Not completely transparent, but you can see some light through it. This one is not kneaded well enough because when I pull it apart, it tears before you can see through it. Mm-hmm. Those glutens have not been developed enough to make a nice tight network that can get so thin that you can see through it, but still hold itself together. So through the magic of time lapse, what you do after you have it kneaded, pretend that you have it kneaded well enough already. Then you put some oil into a bowl and put your dough in here and swirl it around, turn it over so that the whole thing is oiled and it's got oil on top of it. And then you can cover it with a piece of plastic wrap if you want. Sometimes I'll spray the plastic wrap or rub oil on the plastic wrap so it won't stick to the dough, and put it aside and let it raise. This is the first raising. This is when it's developing a lot of its gluten. This is when the yeast is making that carbon dioxide and the gluten is stretching to include all those bubbles in there. Just pretend we fast forwarded 2 hours, okay? All of a sudden, we have one that's done. Look at this. So he's ready. He has risen. And the first thing you get to do after it's done rising is my favorite part of bread baking. You get to punch it down. And you don't have to punch really hard, but it's called degassing. All you do is set your hand in the middle. Oh, there's a big bubble. And you're just sort of letting it go down a little bit. And then you turn it out onto a floured surface. And then you can knead it just a little bit, and then you can start to form it into whatever shape you want to form it into. Now, this has got a lot of oil on it, but you know, let's see if he passes the window pane test. Oh yeah, see how you can start to look through it? You can start to see the light through it, and it's still not pulling apart? Yeah, he's all kneaded. He's kneaded really well. So, here is where a bench knife gets to be really useful. You can split off a piece of it and divide it into what you want. You can scrape something up if you need to scrape it off. I love my bench knife. These are the 2 bread baking things that I treated myself to, little special things that work really well.
It looks like you're petting it.
Yeah, see how shiny it is? I'm pulling it in between my fingers. See, that's the window pane test right there. You can just pull it apart and it stretches without breaking. It will eventually tear once it gets too thin, but the idea is you knead your little piece of dough for a little bit, get him all nice and stretched out, and then you shape him into whatever shape you want. You can make it just into a little roll and put it in there. You can pinch it into 3 little rolls, make 3 little rolls and put them right in next to each other. Those are called cloverleaf rolls, and then they raise up together into like a 3-bumped kind of roll. You can take them and roll it out flat and cut rectangles and spread butter on it, and then slap 4 or 5 rectangles up against each other and stack them in there. Those are called Parker House rolls. When they raise up together, the butter prevents them from sticking too tight to each other. So you pull it out and you can pull each of the levels off. Pull off each of the layers, flaky, buttery layers.
How do you do that?
You just cut little rectangles and you stack them like a deck of cards, and you put 4 or 5 in here and 4 or 5 in here and 4 or 5 in
You
here.
have to roll it out pretty thin.
Yeah, fairly. You could roll it out into a breadstick. Technically, you could roll out 3 of these and braid them together if you wanted to. You could get a...
I know.
You can make it into a pretzel.
Oh, yeah.
And then just put your little pretzels on your thing there and let them raise. You could have pretzels. You could make twists. You could make figure 8s, knots, coils, whatever you want to do with them. Up to a certain point, you don't want to bake the dough. You want it to raise. The warmer it is, the faster it'll raise. The cooler it is, the slower it'll raise. But being slow and cool is not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, the longer it takes it to raise, the more flavors are developed in that wheat. The longer that yeast has to work in that dough, the more it breaks down, and the more things it breaks down, the more things it releases. You'll get more flavors, more interesting mixtures of flavors if it takes a lot longer to ferment. Sometimes just because I can, I'll make the dough, I'll raise it, I'll form it into whatever I want, and I'll put it in the fridge and go to sleep and wake up the next day and take it out and bake it. Or you can do the very first ferment. You can mix it all up like we did. We got all our ingredients together, we mixed them all together, we got ready for the first rise. At that point, instead of making it rise for the first time, you can cut it. I cut it, that's the point where I usually cut it into pieces and put it into a Ziploc bag and put it in the freezer. And then I'm done. And anytime I need to make bread, I pull it out, I let it thaw, either in the fridge or on the countertop. Once it's thawed, then I raise it and I shape it and I bake it, and I've got more dough. So I'll make a big old batch and I'll put it all in the freezer and then pull out one at a time and make a pizza that night, or pull out a little bit and make some rolls.
So you won't let it raise. You'll mix it all together and then.
Just mix it all together, and before it even raises, just stick it right in the
Okay.
fridge. Now it will raise just a little bit before it freezes solid, so you have to have a little bit of room. Like, I wouldn't put this into a quart baggie, I'd put it into a gallon bag, because it will move just a little bit, but it'll freeze solid and keep there for 3 months in the deep freeze.
And now if you leave it on the counter to defrost, is it going to?
It will raise in there eventually. It'll defrost, and then it'll start raising itself up. And then after it's done, then you've got one raise.
So you don't necessarily, when you put it on the counter to defrost it, you don't need to necessarily work it as soon as it's, you can
No,
even continue.
just
to-
let it go.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, there is a school of thought, and this is one of the books called Needlessly Simple. There's a school of thought about not kneading your dough at all. The simple act of the yeast creating all that carbon dioxide and you pushing it down, and then it makes more carbon dioxide, and you push it down and it keeps making more, that's almost as good as kneading. Now it'll take a whole lot longer. You can make bread without kneading it in 5 minutes a day. You make your dough, you knead it just about 5 minutes, put it in the refrigerator. The next day you take it out, you punch it down, you knead it for 5 minutes, put it back in the fridge. The next day you take it out, you punch it down, you knead it for about 5 minutes, you put it back in the fridge. And all that raising, continual raising and degassing, is enough to work those glutens in together so that you don't actually have to do all that kneading. Now you have to babysit it 5 minutes a day every day. And it's done in 3 days, so you gotta start 3 days ahead of time, but it works. So that'll work that way too. So if you want to if you want it really fast, put it in a warm place, let it go as quickly as you can. If you want it to go slower, say maybe you want to go to sleep and wake up and bake it in the morning, you can put it in the fridge and it'll develop a little more flavor. If it takes 3 days to make it, it's going to develop even more flavor. And if I've done this before where I make the dough, I let it raise the first time, I punch it down, and I get ready to do something and I can't do it right now, I just put it back and let it raise a second time, bring it back out, punch it down, form it into whatever I want, let it raise a little bit, and then bake it. It won't hurt it to raise a second time. Now, if you keep going with this, and I tried this one time just to see how long I could keep going with it, after the third or fourth time of it raising outside in the temperature here, it started to create a lot of alcohol. When I baked it, you could smell the alcohol baking off of the loaf. It would smell really good. It didn't taste all the alcohol baked off of it. You couldn't taste it. But it will start creating a fair amount of alcohol. The alcohol just starts to accumulate in there after it's put out so much carbon dioxide. So there's all sorts of ways. There's actually, in The Bread Baker's Apprentice, which is like the Bible of bread baking, he actually talks about a poolish and a biga. A poolish is a little more, this would be a biga. It is dough that hasn't risen yet, and you use this and you raise this or you use this to start another recipe. You use this as your base, and then you add whatever it is you're going to add and make your other recipe.
Well, isn't there a sourdough base?
That we'll get to that one too. There's a poolish is a lot thinner than this. You actually have to stir it with a spoon. But you make that and you let it set for 24 hours. Then you come back and you start adding the rest of your ingredients for your bread. So you're actually kind of pre-fermenting the bread. And I like this book because it's just got one kind of bread from just about every little ethnic group in America. Any place you go where there's a group of people that supposedly have a really good kind of bread, he's got them. Pretzels, bagels, sourdough from San Francisco. This is the one I use most of the time because it's basic, it's simple, it's got like a master dough recipe that you can turn into 15 things if you need to. It's got a master sweet bread recipe that you can turn into all these sweet breads if you want, or a master savory recipe. And this guy I use. Don't use bread machine recipes by hand, and don't use hand recipes in a bread machine. They're not made that way. And they even make special yeast just for your bread machine. I use regular yeast in my bread machine and I haven't had a problem, but I would recommend you use bread machine yeast in your bread machine recipes with your bread machine, and hand stuff by your hands. I wouldn't mix the two just on the off chance that something is made specifically for one and not for another. So then you've got something like sourdough, which is wild yeast that live in the air around us all over. You can capture them by mixing some flour and some water and leaving it sit on your countertops somewhere where the flies won't get to it. Usually they'll put like a piece of cheesecloth or something over the top so the flies and dirt can't get in. And you just let it sit there. After about a week or so, it'll start bubbling and foaming, and you hopefully will have captured some wild yeast. So you feed it a little sugar, and you feed it a little flour, and it bubbles away, and you can keep it in your fridge. And if you don't use it, every couple of months, you got to take it out and make sure it's still alive. Feed it a little flour, feed it a little sugar. It's kind of like a pet. And it stays alive in your fridge for a few months. And then when you want to make sourdough, you take it out and you take the whole batch of it, feed it flour and sugar, and get it all going, and then you take some of that back and put it in your container, put it in the fridge, and save it for next time. And then what's left you can use as the dough base to start adding more flour and all the other ingredients you want to make in your sourdough. And sourdough is whatever yeasts you get. It just so happens that people really like the flavor of the yeasts in San Francisco, so they like their sourdough. You know, it's the same thing happened with I'm trying to think of the name of the guys that went up the gold rush in Alaska. The guys were called sourdoughs because they used to take a bag and put sourdough starter in it and stick it inside their coat so it wouldn't freeze up there, and then they'd go to wherever they were going in the next camp or whatever, and they'd get there and all they'd have to do is take it out and mix flour and sugar and mix it all together. And they used that instead of yeast because they didn't just carry yeast with them. They carried the sourdough with them though wherever they went. So a lot of the cooks up there in the Yukon were called sourdoughs. And after I was given some sourdough that was originally started in the Yukon in the 1890s, and it was passed on through generations to my great aunt, and she lived in Idaho and she gave us some and we used it. But the truth of the matter is, after all that many years, the yeasts get replaced with whatever your yeasts are in your area. So there's probably not any yeast left from the Yukon in that stuff anymore. It's all whatever yeast we have around here. I do have a friend who wanted an extremely sour sourdough bread, really bite you back sour. So she took water and flour and vinegar and set it out, and whatever yeast could possibly survive that kind of acidic environment had to be more acidic than that. And that was the yeast she cultivated for her sourdough. And it tasted like, it was tangy, like it had lemon juice or vinegar in it. But it was just a sourdough that she had purposely captured only the yeast that could survive very high acidic temperature or acidity.
Do you have a preference over glass or metal when you bake breads?
Metal will get browner around the bottom and the sides than glass will. Glass will hold it in and it'll stay softer around the sides. But it really only matters if you want a crunchy crust or not. Oh, before we bake them, before you bake them, you want to make sure your oven is accurate. If you have a thermometer, an oven thermometer, put it in there and see if 400 on the dial really equals 400 in the oven or not. You also might have to do a little bit of finagling. Some ovens have hot spots. So you might have to get in there halfway through and turn them around 180 degrees halfway through, just in case it's hotter on one side than the other. The baking time will be, it's really hard to say whether you have one loaf or two loaves or several little pieces of it. Usually 350 to 400. Sometimes when you're doing like a pizza and you want a really hot surface, they'll have a baking stone, and you'll crank that oven up as high as it'll go and get that stone searing hot, and then you stick your pizza on there and it just flash cooks right. So that's like 500 degrees or something if you want to do that. How to know if your bread is done? It'll be brown and crusty on top. It won't take the indentation of a fingerprint. You know, when you put your finger on there and you know that's, so it will have like a crust on top of it. It will sound hollow. When you tap on it with your nail, it'll sound hollow. It won't sound like a thud, like dough. It'll sound like a knocking, like it's hollow. Probably the best way to know is the temperature. When it reaches an internal temperature of 180 to 200 degrees. Starting at 150 is when the proteins start to gelatinize. They start to come together. A really, really wet dough that you want to make rustic bread with those great big open holes, that might go up closer to 215. Or a really soft dough with a lot of eggs and milk and butter and sugar in it, you might want it on the lower end of 170 or 180. So that's why I put 180 to 200 or so. And of course, smaller pieces will cook faster than one whole loaf. 2 loaves will cook slower than 1 loaf.
So basically, you just have to watch it.
Yeah, you just have to watch it. I had a problem with my oven in the beginning. I was putting it too high up, and the top would bake and get even black before the bottom was even ready yet. See, another reason I like glass is I can see through it and tell if that crust is brown yet or if it's still white. So one other thing we're going to do before we put our stuff in the oven, we're going to do some toppings. You can brush the top with water or egg white, and then you can sprinkle things on it like sesame seeds or poppy seeds, or you could brush the top with melted butter, or you could put cinnamon sugar on the top, or you could slice through the top, and at the last minute the slice will open up as it bakes. So we're going to make some toppings on them, and then we're going to put them in the oven, and then we'll take them out and eat them. We got some really chunky salt that you can put on top of your pretzel if you like. Make sure you put water or brush water or egg white on there first. Brush water or egg white on before you put poppy seeds, sesame seeds, cinnamon sugar. You could just brush melted butter straight on it. Melted butter with cinnamon sugar on top is also pretty good.
Probably.
While you're decorating, I will read you some quotes about bread. Love doesn't sit there like a stone. It has to be made like bread. Remade all the time. Made new. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. That one comes out of the Bible. And then people say things like, remember, man does not live by bread alone. Sometimes he needs a little buttering up. In the Lord's Prayer, the first petition is for daily bread. No one can worship God or love his neighbor on an empty stomach. Man cannot live by bread alone, he must have peanut butter. Bread for myself is a material question, bread for my neighbor is a spiritual one. You can't just leave out one part. The bread won't rise if the yeast isn't there. For one country is different from another. Its earth is different, as are its stones, its wines, its bread, its meat, and everything that grows and thrives in a specific region. That would be back, that's Paracelsus, that's back in the Roman Empire. That would be because in each different region they had different wild yeasts infecting their bread, not infecting, but making their bread rise, and so each one would taste a little different. You'd go over to the next valley or over on the other side of the mountain and it would taste different because they had different yeasts there. Oh, look at that. How pretty. Let's put them in the oven. And this is 400 degrees. And we're gonna do maybe 15 to 20 minutes. We'll check it at 15 and see what we get after that. Okay. If you put water on top of your little dough things before you bake them, it'll just make stuff adhere. It'll make whatever you're going to put on it adhere to the top. If you use egg whites, beaten egg whites, they're mostly protein, so it's going to make this crackly crust with like a shiny shine to it. If you use butter, it's going to make it a soft, it's more like the oil, it's going to make a soft, it'll be a little bit shiny, but it's more soft than anything on the top. And of course that buttery flavor. So. They had smell-o-vision because it smells so good.
Awesome.
The cinnamon and the sugar and the yeast, the dough, the fresh bread smell, it's just wonderful. The most important part, you don't want to hear it, but rest your bread after you bake it. If you cut right into it, it's going to be soggy, it's not ready yet. Give it 5 minutes to just sit and cool off and for all those proteins to solidify in there. Right now, they're in there with a lot of steam. And if you slice that open, that steam's going to escape. You want it to stay inside and keep it warm and gelatinize everything and solidify it. And then when it cools off enough that you can touch it, then you can carefully slice it and eat it. Homemade bread will go bad faster than store-bought bread because it doesn't have any preservatives in it. So you can keep it on the countertop, but it's going to go stale within a day or so. You can keep it in a plastic bag in the refrigerator, maybe up to a week. But you could also wrap it tightly and put it in the freezer. Make it sure it comes down to room temperature first and then wrap it up real tightly. It'll keep in the freezer for about a month. And you can thaw it out and use it then too if you want. So that's bread baking.